whenever you're ready. I'm just going to test it for sound.
Oh, sure, sure.
So, just tell me, what's your name, where are we, and do I have permission to use this tape?
Yeah. Okay, I'm Richard Lanigan. We're at Victoria College of the University of Toronto, in Toronto, October 2001. You have my permission to do this tape. It's going to be an enjoyable experience.
Okay, you can look at me.
Oh, yeah, okay, then we'll get the camera. All right. Charles Peirce's notion of sign relationship is really about learning, and the way I like to explain Peirce is to remember that Peirce was a champion of plain English. He liked things in simple, although he was a theoretician, he liked things in simple formats, English that could be understood, but occasionally he had problems and invented technical terms to be precise. And so while I'll use some of these technical terms, I'll try and put them in a plain English form as well. The basic thing about sign relationships and sign functions is to remember that you're talking about learning, how human beings learn things. So with that in mind, it's easy to recall having learned something. We all have experiences, and when that same kind of context or situation occurs again, we, in our own mind, tell ourselves, well, I've learned how to do that. Well, in a technical sense, this is what Peirce means by a relationship called the interpretant. And what he means is you've had an experience that you are using as a rule to understand your current experience. Now this rule is just an idea, but it's kind of a memory. It's a memory of how that first experience went, and you're reapplying it in the same experience because it's similar. So you need to think of interpretant not by its technical name, but as a moment where you've learned how to learn. So what have you learned? Well, you've learned that in this experience your behavior, your concern was focused on something, which is usually referred to as the object. So you've been learning about this object. But how did you come to learn this? Well, that's what Peirce calls the representimum. There was something that expressed the condition to you. And so just to use a different kind of shorthand, when we learn things, what we're talking about is what I perceived in one situation, but then when I come to the second situation, how do I express what I've learned? Now, sometimes we shorten that by saying, well, that's teaching, that's how you teach someone. But you want to flip that over, because what the interpretant does is it combines a situation in which the situation itself was a teacher, and what you perceived was the learning of that. And so the first situation expresses a condition. The second experience is a perception of that original expression. So you're combining two experiences that you've learned from. Now, what's the real applied function of this? Well, this kind of learning is what we use to be efficient in our daily lives. Instead of learning everything over and over again, going to a door, learning how to open the knob, we don't have to learn that after the first time. And so what Peirce is trying to get at is that we have large collections of interpretants. We have large collections of memories, of experiences that we have already lived through, and we don't have to repeat it. We simply know about it. We can project in our mind what's going to happen. And our whole daily life relies on these interpretants, these codes of behaviors, because we can anticipate what we could do or not do, and this is what Peirce referred to as capacity. I have the capacity to know how to open a door, even though I'm not standing up and going to the door. I can glance at the door. I have the capacity of how to get through it, and so on. Well, that's a relatively simple example, but Peirce was interested in this, how this capacity builds upon itself. And so what he was really interested in is the fact that one interpretant can be a learning experience which in essence can be generalized to lots of possible learning experiences. And so this is where you get into the kind of technical description where you say an interpretant can be an interpretant of another interpretant. In other words, we can have a series of these learning experiences. Well, that's a very familiar concept because that's what culture is. We know that learning experience as culture. We get born into a family. Our parents have inherited a bunch of interpretants from their parents. So we have a whole history of learning experiences called family knowledge. This includes everything from the vocabulary that the family uses, its own dictionary or lexicon of words. Every person, unknown to themselves, carries a lot of family interpretants in vocabulary. There are certain words used in the family that not only are used by the parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-great-grandparents. See, those great-great-grandparents, they still have 2 or 3 vocabulary words that are actively spoken in the family. They've just come down through the generations, this cultural transmission. Well, those key words that everybody likes and uses are interpretants. Those words name a kind of experience that the family had. That experience is important to the family interaction, its function, so those words stay alive in the vocabulary. A good example of this sort of thing is what a particular family will refer to, how they'll name a soft drink. In the family, when you want a soft drink, what do you call it? Do you call it a soda, a pop, a Coke, a fizzy? There are lots and lots of vocabulary that name the family, the region, the country. Mere selection of one of those words is an interpretant for everybody who hears it. We get all of these learning experiences that we know belong to the person that we're listening to, and we know that they have come from other people in the family and the situation. And so this kind of vocabulary is a string of interpretant, of interpretant, of interpretant. Now, once we understand that kind of learning experience, then we can move over to the other 2 parts of the equation, because remember the interpretant is holding a representimum and an object together. Our learning experience, in the first instance, lines up a bunch of possible objects. And this is where the famous Whorf-Sapir hypothesis comes in. The hypothesis being that your vocabulary determines the kind of reality you can experience. If I have a word for shirt, then when I speak, I refer to shirts, and everybody who understands the word shirt can look around and find one and say, oh yeah, you're wearing one. But what if I wanted to talk about the underside of the couch that I'm sitting on? Well, there's no name for that. I have to use a long description, the underside of the couch I'm sitting on. Well, cultures like to get efficient, and so I get tired of saying the underside of the couch I'm sitting on, so I say, well, I'm going to give this object, this experience, a name. We'll call it George. The underside of the couch is George. In my classes, I use this for the underside of a desk. So every student who's ever had a class from me, when I meet them in the hall, I say, "How's George?" You see, and so we have an interpreter. We have a learning experience of a learning experience that refers to an object, but this is family knowledge. Nobody outside of the class knows that George is the underside of a desk. So that's how objects in a culture start to assimilate into the learning experience. The language names and categories not things, but the experience of things. Objects are really named by the interpretant that led up to the identification of an object. So objects are contextual, they're experiential. So that's one side of the equation. We've got the representative, this...
Call it a sign.
A sign. Okay. The representative is just the technical name for sign, and the way to think about signs is that it's expression. If you take the simple equation that on one side there's expression, on the other side there's perception, then objects get perceived, signs get expressed. When expression and perception come together as an experience, that's the interpretant. So back to the signs. Just as we did with learning object functions, there are expression functions or sign functions. And typically, Peirce focused in on this expressive power of the sign by simply reminding people about how they got over to this object experience. How did you learn the object experience? And generally, if you take that in human terms, it's very easy, because Peirce was a great existentialist. He believed that science systems emanate out of the person and your body experience, and that's quite true. The world that I experience is my position in that world. So signs then took on the three famous functions: the icon, index, and symbol. And that's a very handy little way of talking about sign expression, because if you take an icon, an icon really is just something that has physical properties. So I can touch my watch, which is an icon. It's a physical thing. So it's very easy to use iconic expression. I simply have to show objects. I can show my watch, I can show my pen. However, we quickly come to realize that that's a very limiting process, because first of all, not everything is a physical object. There are things like freedom, love, that are abstractions, and you can't have an object. So that's not a problem for human beings. We simply invent an object to go for it. So if I want to show that I love someone, then I get a Valentine's card. I go select an object and put the expression into it and make it into an icon. Well, sometimes it's inconvenient, or we want to filter our expression or be careful about how we're saying things, so we don't really want to get into the icon business. We don't want to be in the business of the cultural business of gift giving, where I've got an object and I make a relationship of that object with you, and it creates an obligation. Maybe you have to give a gift back. So sometimes we want to stay away from that kind of explicit commitment to objects. In which case we shift down a level. We go to a level that is more abstract, meaning that we're taking some of the information out of the object. So instead of the object, I get a representation of it. And this Valentine's Day card is a good example, because remember now, the real icon was my feeling of love for someone, and I can't really directly show that, or I may be hesitant about showing it, so I go to the indexical level. I get a card which kind of points in that direction. An index points in the direction because it starts to leave out a dimension. Icons are objects, they're three-dimensional, they exist in time, but the index throws away a dimension. It's not quite an object. In the case of a card, it's got height and width, but there's really no depth to it. It's not an object in the usual sense. So the card comes close, but it leaves out something, so it's not too close. But even that may be too much. I may be thinking about a romantic relation with someone, and I don't want to be too forward, so I don't even want to send the Valentine's Day card. Well, that shifts me down one more level to the symbol, the symbolic sign. And for most people, this just means that we're going to use words. We'll talk about it. I'm not going to kiss the person, have an iconic relationship. I'm not going to send the Valentine's card. That's a little bit too forward. So what am I going to do? Well, I'll talk about maybe having coffee with you. I use language to represent this reality I would like to take place, but represent it only in a very, very limited way. Now, most cultures find this a convenient way to go about things. That's why most cultures are formed around language. We learn a language, we learn how to manipulate it, and language doesn't commit us too much. It's just an exchange of ideas and feelings with the other person. Something represents something else, we're not too committed. If the person likes what they hear, if you like what you're saying, now you can shift up the scale. You can become indexical. Your language can go from being vague to precise. It can be iconic. As you are talking, you can start to do what you're talking about, and it becomes an iconic relationship. And this becomes the formation of an interpretant. And if that's a good first experience, you'll do it again. You'll have an interpretant of an interpretant, which will mean you're repeating your experience of the object. It means you're using the sign again. The system has been set up and you're using the sign. The more that you use the sign, the more you repeat the learning experience, the better it feels. You learn positive and negative experience, and you come to a real understanding of the object. And so you are really in the business, you personally are in the business of culture formation. You're adding a kind of unique learning experience, one interpreted, into this great pile of interpretants that other people have amassed for the culture, and you're making your little contribution to that. Every time you repeat your expressive and perceptual behavior, you legitimize, confirm the culture. By the same token, though, every time you break the cultural rule, you diminish that cultural orientation a little bit. So we get into the business of the large distinction between cultural signs and social signs, and the way to think about this is that cultural signs are the ones that exist over a long period of time, and typically anthropologists will get this right by talking about time units of 1,000 years. Cultures have time units of 1,000 years, and anything shorter than that probably is not a cultural sign, because cultural signs don't change much. They endure for a long time. On the other hand, social semiotics, social signs, this is what we usually think of when we talk about fad behavior. Some kind of clothing is popular all of a sudden, but 2 months later it's not popular anymore. So this is a spatial characteristic. Social semiotics deals basically with spatial conditions where things come into a place and they leave that place. So our usual concern is, in social semiotics, is where something is being learned. Did you learn it at home? Did you learn it at school? Did you learn it from your friends? And that pattern of interpretants, those experiences that you're learning, how enduring are they? The ones that you learned from your family, for example, have high cultural significance because they represent slow pace of change. The family doesn't change much over its generations. On the other hand, if you're talking about a child at school, then you have more of an emphasis on the social semiotics, and you know that every day that your child goes to school, things change, come home and you hear about it. And so there's very little cultural significance to the daily activity of the child as compared, for example, to the daily activity of the parents at home. So you get this coordination of space and time learning, and you are spatially indexing it, social semiotics, and you are temporally indexing it, cultural semiotics. So all of this then amounts to the sign system. We have ways of identifying signs, and we have these various systems of putting them together. And I'll just review them very quickly. There's the individual sign system, which consists of that original formulation of sign or representative, interpretant, and object. That individual system then gets into a dynamic of expression and perception in a social system, and this is usually where we become concerned with the icon, the index, the symbol. We want a social referent for the application of our learning experience. And then the next question becomes, how long is this experience going to last? And that becomes cultural semiotics. We take a time inventory of how long this thing endures, how long the sign endures, where it endures, its function. Is it a dying function? It is a growing function. And so we get to a point where we talk about Peirce's doctrine of unlimited semiosis, which is, again, just a technical shorthand for saying that individuals in a social and cultural context are in positions of, or I should say levels of learning, individual learning, group learning, social learning, cultural learning, and it's a grand cycle where in the end the culture is the family that you were born into. That cultural context is there. So it goes in a grand cycle, but it's not a closed circle. It's a growing system, because every learning experience slightly changes the way in which we learn things. So what I'm after here is, even though we have a sign system and we learn a sign system, the encounter with individual signs changes the system slightly. So it's always adapting, always assimilating new information, and that's why as an individual, even though I engage in activities that I know how to do, for example, I know how to open a door, nonetheless, I'm constantly thinking about that. When I get up to leave the room and I go to the door, my mind does a very quick, a nanosecond kind of review of interpretants. As I approach the door, my mind is very quickly doing things like saying, is that a doorknob or is it a door handle? Because my hand, which isn't there yet, is going to have to grasp the door opener. And it makes a difference whether I have to twist or I'm going to shove down. And that mechanical problem is immediately translated back up into a social level, because I then have an affective response, an emotional response to this. And I have the feeling, I now have a feeling, and this is again now an interpretant of an interpretant. I'm doing some learning about learning. I'm having an emotional learning experience about a cognitive event. I'm going to the door, and I have a feeling about whether this is going to be a pleasant or unpleasant experience. And I get to the door, and it's a doorknob. And I think, this is unpleasant. I think it's unpleasant because I feel it's unpleasant. And why do I feel that? Well, because I remember when I was 4 years old, and I didn't have the body, the embodiment to turn that knob. The knob coded. It was an interpretant for the adult world. The doorknob was a control device that kept me out of places. So I carry that old interpretant from childhood, and I like doors that have a handle you can pull down, because as a child I could pull down that handle and get out of the room. I had control over the door. So this interpretant, this is a cultural interpretant for me personally. You see, I have a learning experience that is carried through time and has become permanent in my mind. I forever would prefer a handled door to a knob door. Well, you generalize this out in your experience, and you realize how Peirce's relatively simple process of a sign, interpretant, object forms a complex sign system that you embody as a person. You simply carry all of this learning experience in the way that you like to use your body. So I think I've come full circle then about the function of the sign, from the individual through culture, from the key relationship of learning, the interpretant that holds together perception, the object, and expression, the sign, and how expression and perception come together as the unique communication event that semiotics is. This is a record in space and time of individuals and cultures and groups, and the communication event, how expression and perception constantly cycle each other but are new every time. So communication in the end, and we can have a little formula really, communication in the end is simply the interpretant. Peirce took this very complex process and reduced it down to an idea, the interpretant, the mechanism that allows me to use and understand communication. That's all I know.
That was great. That was great.
When we consider the relationship of the sign system in parts, the sign, the representative, and the object, I usually think it's easier to understand what is a fairly sophisticated relationship by going to social experience and trying to pull out of our own experience what some of these relationships are. And one of the easy ways to do this is to confront the difference between fact and opinion, which those are categories we use for everything and are very familiar to us, but when we're asked about it or we stop and think about it, what is the difference between a fact and opinion, then we start to get lost. And Semiotics offers us a nice little analytic tool in its parts to see the distinction. Basically what happens is all of us as human beings have experiences, and that's what normally other people would tag as your opinion. When you explain your experience, well, that's your opinion. And we're interested in having a broader acceptance of that. We don't want just to express our opinion. We want what we say to have factual standing. Well, a general sociologist's view of this thing would be, well, you get a fact when a lot of people, you count. 100 people have this opinion, so for those 100 people it's going to function as a fact, meaning that they don't debate it, they don't argue about it anymore. It's just a kind of experience that they all have in common and can talk about. Well, push that back to an individual situation. You have an experience of something, which is what that means is you're taking in some information. And that's what a sign is. A sign is just any kind of information that you experience. But that information has a context, that it fits into a pattern in the system. You know that information because it is framed by some kind of understanding. Well, that sign information really for each of us as a person counts as a fact. It's not an opinion. We don't have this social condition judging it. What I experience is a fact for me. Now the challenge here is, how can my fact experience be matched up to another person's fact experience? Well, basically we have two shots at this, two ways of doing it. We can talk about the relationship of the sign to the object. That is, this fact that I've experienced, I can refer to somehow. I can talk about it, or I can ask a person to do something that I've just done so that we have the same body experience. We try for a matchup. So whenever I can match up this learning experience with the event or the object or the thing that I'm doing, then I generate a fact that the two of us agree that this sign, this information, is a fact. It takes on the condition of being an object. It has objective status for us, and that's what we mean by objective. We mean that somehow, usually in a behavioral sense, I can do what you've done. That confirms it as a fact. Now, if I can't duplicate it, if I can't do what you say you've done, then I say, well, that's just going to have to be your opinion. I just can't do it. Meaning that we can engage in the same sign behavior, but my behavior just doesn't produce that object.